Hello and welcome to Draw With Me. I'm Danny Gregory and I am just doing a last minute couple of checks to see that everything is good. So hold on, we'll be just hello and welcome to Draw With Me. Excellent. Danny Gregory. Apparently it works. And I am so good. Sorry, I just had to do a sort of little bit of YouTube selfieing to make sure that in fact I was showing up, and I appear to be, so that's great. And I'm glad to see that there are some folks out here to join me, to draw with me today. Today we are going to do a very simple exercise that I think has lots of great potential, lots of great kind of learning opportunities. It's also sort of meditative and calm and nice. And it is something that I think that you will enjoy, and all you'll need is, well, I have a shoelace. So hopefully you have a shoelace or some kind of a cord, if you have something like that. But a shoelace, pull one out of your shoe if you need to, and that's what we're going to be drawing because it's sort of a random shape and it's flexible and it'll allow us to think about a bunch of different kind of drawing sort of principles or techniques or practices, okay? And I'm going to be using a few different devices for this. Not devices. I'm going to have a couple of markers that I'm going to use. You don't need them. You can do this just with a pen. But I do have a couple of markers, and I also have a couple of different pens, different thicknesses of pen. So I have a fountain pen, which I probably won't use. I have this, which is a pin pen, a Unipen. It is 0.1. It's fairly narrow gauge, so I may not end up using it. And then I have my my Tombow manga pen, Fudenosuke, and it is a flexible. It was a calligraphy pen, but I use it for non-calligraphic purposes too. So anyway, so get yourself a nice pen, and if you have a marker or two, that could be useful as we try different things, okay? So let me see, is there any comments or complaints or issues that we need to address first among you all? Is there anything that anybody is interested in discussing? I see that there's folks from all over here. Catherine from Coquitlam, British Columbia. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it. Renee from Amsterdam and Kathy from Connecticut. Bonnie from Oregon. Renata from Houston. Thistle from the middle of nowhere, California. And Deb from Brooklyn. Susan from I'm not sure where. John from Hertfordshire. Is that correct? Hertfordshire in England. And Janice from Falls Church, Virginia. And Christine from Oregon. So lots of folks from lots of places, and that's nice. What do we have here? Catherine saying we just celebrated our 590th Urban Sketcher Vancouver meetup this past weekend. That's amazing. You must have drawn all of Vancouver at this point. That's a great accomplishment. Fantastic. And let's see, what else do we have here? We have Deb, whose wife has given her a 20-ounce mug of coffee. You'll need it because we're going to be doing a lot of drawing. Let's see, who else? We have Dana from Oklahoma. And so, yes. So it is a rainy Thursday in early October here. Yesterday we had what was supposed to be the hottest October 2nd in history, in New York at least. It was pretty hot. It wasn't that crazy. I mean, it's October, so it shouldn't be that hot. But yes, it was reasonable. Jesus from Guadalajara. Very nice. And okay, so let's begin. Let's begin to draw. Let's begin to talk about drawing instead of talking about the weather, because honestly, what could be more tedious than that? So let's go over here and have a look at my drawing pad. But first of all, let's begin with this shoelace. And our shoelace, we're just going to drop it in kind of a random way. So just drop it in some kind of a random way that looks attractive. And let's just talk about what are the different ways that we can tackle this as a subject. You may not be able to draw my actual shoelace just because I'm probably going to need the real estate to show you my pad. So, but I'm going to move it over here, and I'm going to move my camera over here, and see if you can see both. So you can't actually, but I'll swivel back and forth. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say, why don't we just take our shoelace. Hopefully you all have shoelaces to draw from, so you're not just copying off mine. Bring your own damn shoelace. But I'm going to start by saying, okay, I'm going to take what happens to be a reasonably close color, and I'm just going to draw. Like, what is the first way that we could draw this? Is we could just draw it, right? Just sort of draw the general shape of this thing, and do this, and then this, and then there. So, that's right. That's an approximation of what this looks like, and that is basically a sort of a contour drawing of the shoelace, right? And I did it, as you could see, fairly quickly, and that's a type of drawing. So we could call that. Let's just call that a contour drawing, right? There it is, contour. I think that's certainly a way of doing this drawing this shoelace, but I think there are more interesting things to think about. So let's try again, but let's try this time looking at the negative space here, because there's quite a lot of negative space here. And what does that mean, negative space? What does it refer to here when we're talking about a shoelace? Well, what it means is, instead of drawing the orange shoelace, let's draw the yellow underneath it. So let's draw these areas, and let's pretend the shoelace isn't there, but let's just draw the yellow. Okay, so so I'm going to just draw these yellow shapes. Sorry about all this camera work, but here we go. So I'm just drawing, there's that one yellow shape, and then I'm going to draw this shape that is here. I think negative space is something that is potentially confusing to people, because you don't really see it. We're drawing kind of what isn't really there. We're drawing everything but what we want to be drawing, which is the shoelace. But this will give you an idea of how we look at something like that, So I'm drawing the outsides of these shapes, and I have to have some kind of an edge to this, so I'm just going to sort of make up an edge. Can you see this? I'm making up an edge to my negative space. I'm drawing a kind of a frame around it that doesn't really exist, but that will just help me to define it more. And then looking at this shape here, I'm drawing in here. So what's happening is the shoelace is emerging, right? I'm starting to sort of see the shoelace, even though I'm not really seeing it. And this is a really helpful technique for a bunch of different reasons. It's really helpful when you're drawing landscapes, particularly urban sketching sorts of landscapes, to know what you're not drawing. For instance, if you're drawing the sky, you can start by drawing the sky because it's a simple shape, whereas sometimes what we see in an urban landscape is overwhelmingly complicated, and we're not able to kind of find a focus. But by doing this, you end up with an approximation of what the silhouettes are, and then you can say, okay, now I at least have somewhere to begin, because that's so often the problem when you're drawing a complex landscape, is that that you're just overwhelmed by where to begin, right? So this way I'm able to sort of start to see the outlines. So I'm not going to draw this entire shoelace, but you get that idea, right? That what I've drawn is the non-shapes. Okay, so let's try a different technique. Let me try something else here. Another idea is to say, what if we draw shoelace in terms of sections, okay? So, or shapes really. So let's have a look at this shoelace as a series of shapes, because we can break it down into its component shapes, and those might be more manageable than having to tackle the whole thing. So we can look at this as a shape. We can look at this line here, right? It starts there and it continues down here, and then it sort of tapers off there. That's a shape. And then the inside of this is another shape. So let me just show you what I'm talking about by doing it. So let's move this up close, and I can say, all right, I'm going to draw this shape as I see it. It ends here, and then it hits there, and then it continues along here, and then it ends there. So it's a shape. Now it is part of a shoelace, but I'm not telling my brain that. I'm just telling my brain to look at the shape. And now I'm going to look at this second part, and I'm going to say, okay, that's another piece, another shape that goes in like that. And then there's this curve that comes down here, and then there's another shape that seems to twist and go back behind here, and then this connects back here again. So hopefully you're able to see the connections between these, that I'm breaking it down into these shapes. So now I'm going to take this, the part of the shoelace that is kind of hard, that you use to thread through the hole, and then I'm going to look at where does this piece intersect. This is the continuation of the same piece. It kind of intersects there and there, right? It intersects this line here, intersects there. And now I look at how this piece is sort of thin, and then there's the sort of top of the lace, and then there is a piece that goes like that. I've lost my place here a bit. Okay, and this part comes down and goes around and goes there and is cut off by the part that's going over it. And then this part is going to snake down there and intersect. And this is probably the largest shape that we've seen so far. It ends kind of there. But I can tell by, now here's an interesting thing to consider. You might notice that this part isn't really correct when you look at that part. And one of the ways that I can tell that is by looking at the negative space. So this space in here, right, this space in here, doesn't really correspond with that space in there. That space is much larger. So I can tell by looking at the negative space that I've made this the wrong length, you know. But then I look at this negative space here, and at least from my angle, this is reasonably correct. So what it tells me is that, in fact, this line it looks a bit different from my point of view than it does from the camera's point of view. From the camera's point of view, it looks like this line goes here. But so you see, what I'm doing by breaking this into shapes, I'm looking at the size and the relationships simply by looking at where each shape is and how it intersects with every other shape. And then I could say that this top part is a bit of a shape like that too. So you see what I'm doing by reducing this to shapes, and I'm really having to observe carefully to see these shapes. Got it? So that's interesting. So this is a common thing, I think, which is Francine's world says halfway through drawing the negative space, she gets confused and starts drawing the shape too. That's what's helpful about having this kind of colored background situation, is you can just say to yourself, just draw yellow. Don't think about what it is, just draw yellow. So try and find a contrasting background, and that's why drawing just the sky, for instance, instead of drawing buildings is often helpful too. So anyway, so that's the third thing. We can call that shapes. And now let's try, something else, another way of looking at this here, and that is to do a sort of an external contour drawing, a contour drawing of the overall shape here of this lace. So let's look at this entire thing as one shape. So let's see, get a bit more altitude here. So if I was going to look at this whole thing as a shape, I would say, let me draw I'm going to start maybe here, and I'm going to draw this shape, and then I'm going to draw that, and I'm going to come down here. Now I'm starting to get into trouble, and what is the trouble that I'm having? The trouble that I'm having is, how long are these things? How long is this line? How long is that line? You know, this line was a bit easier because there are, as you can see, landmarks. Like this, I can sort of see there's a chunk here, but this is a big long stretch, so I'm getting lost a bit. You know, one thing I can do is I can measure. So I could measure it by holding up my pen and kind of sighting with my eye like that. You know, so I'm sort of like, imagine that I'm holding up the pen to my eye and I'm looking down, I'm measuring it, and I'm saying, okay, this length is the same as that length. So I can say to myself, when I come to my drawing, I can measure that section, and then I can measure that section, and I can say, okay, actually, they're pretty close, you know. And then I can also use this as a landmark, this section in here, the end of the lace, and I can say, all right, that is something that can tell me how long, how far I have to go. But basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to relatively quickly draw the outline. Getting a little bit lost here because I wasn't clear on where to go inside of that shape. But anyway, so drawing this outside, and now I'm looking here, like where does this intersect with the top, which you can't quite see, but where does this intersect with the top? It sort of is kind of here on my drawing. So again, I need to look at that relationship. There we go. And then going down around here, and going here, here, and there. It's sort of a little bit wonky, but it's basically the same shape, I think. Right? This looks kind of fatter than that, so that's something to think about. But now what happens is after I've drawn this outline, then I can start to say, okay, let me look at what is the interior of this shape. So the interior is, again, sort of like the negative space, but not necessarily always negative space, because some of it might be lying on top of something else. You know, in this case, see, so this part bears some relationship to negative space, and that's why it's helpful to have built on that, to have already looked at this in terms of negative space. But there are other things that I might want to consider as well. So after I've drawn this interior these interior shapes, unlike a negative space drawing, I might go in and say, okay, I'm going to go and draw these bits, and then I'm going to draw this bit, and then I'm going to look at how this goes underneath this, then I'm going to look at how this goes over that, and then this part curves actually over there, and then this part swings over there, and it's all a matter of kind of talking your way through it, you know, guiding yourself, giving yourself directions through it. However, not referring to what the thing actually is, if you see what I mean. Like, don't talk about it being a lace. If I was drawing something that was more complicated than shoelace, like say I was drawing a face, try to avoid saying the nose, the eyes, and so forth, and instead say that bumpy bit or where that part intersects another part. Because when we train our brains to not just think in terms of words, then we're also avoiding thinking in terms of symbols. And when we think in terms of symbols, you know, we aren't observing. We're manufacturing observations from a library of observations that we have in our heads. In other words, what we think these things look like, what we think a face looks like. And when it comes to shoelace, we don't really have a lot of kind of built-in information about that. You can also see I've screwed it up in a couple of places, but that gives me the general outline of this. It's reasonably accurate. And so now I've combined a contour drawing like I did originally, and then I've combined negative space, and there are also some shapes in here, like I've created some shapes. So I'm sort of bringing those first three methods together, and those different ways of looking at it add up together to really help me. You know, it's like bringing in different kinds of tools or different kinds of lenses to look at this shoelace with. And okay, so now let's talk about one other element here, which are, there's some interesting things in this shoelace that I haven't managed to capture in this drawing. Let's have a look at the shoelace more closely, and let's observe some things about it. So some things that are interesting are that this is reflective, whereas this is not. So there might be pieces of information that we can give that help the viewer to understand this is a shiny, plasticated part of the shoelace and this wasn't. We can also think about the texture here of this shoelace, that this is rough and woven. We can also think about the fact that it is three-dimensional and that light is hitting it and throwing a shadow down below, that some parts of it, like here, is light, whereas this side is dark. So these are things that we might now want to take and add onto this drawing and say, okay, let's try and kind of represent what's interesting about the shoelace beyond just its shapes. So what are some of the things that we might want to think about capturing, and how are we going to capture them? So let's see what we do with that. Oops, let me go the other way. Sorry, this is like patting my stomach and rubbing my head at the same time. Let me move this guy here and move this guy here. Okay, so let's start with this. So the way that I'm going to represent this part, I'm just going to focus on the drawing. So the way I'm going to represent this part is by, I'm going to draw a couple of horizontal lines, and I'm going to leave part of it white to represent this highlight. And I think I'll do a similar thing here, but I want to look at it's different. I want to make sure that in the case of the other lace, I'm recognizing that if you see here, these are not quite the same, because this highlight is at the top, whereas this highlight is in the middle. You know, so I want to make sure that it doesn't just look like I just blindly made them the same, or that I blindly thought like this is a way of representing shiny light. So I'm trying to represent, in fact, the fact that there's actually more than one highlight. And now when it comes to capturing, oops, I missed this line. When it comes to capturing this texture and capturing the light and dark, I can actually do both at the same time. What I can do is I can use this texture quality in here. I can use it by adding detail, and I'm going to think of a way of doing this. I'm going to just do this kind of line stuff. So I'm drawing these lines, and then I'm going to segment them because they're kind of segmented in various ways, like almost like little bricks. What I'm doing is I'm showing you detail in the shadow, but I'm going to avoid showing it so you get a sense that of two things: A, that this is textured, and B, that it's in shadow. But I'm not going to do it on this highlighted part. I'm going to leave that as it is, leave it white. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to come around. I'm just going to show that there is some kind of shading in here. But you see, if I was to cross-hatch this entire shoelace, it would start to become overwhelming. It would be a lot of work, first of all. But also, I don't think it would really give you that much more information than giving you partial information will. Because sometimes partial information is actually more pleasing for the brain because it allows your brain to fill in the bits that aren't there. Your brain understands, okay, there's probably some other stuff going on there, but I'm not seeing it. I'll fill it in myself. And so your brain gets actively engaged at looking rather than being told exactly what to see. And so the brain of the viewer becomes a kind of a collaborator in making the image, if you understand what I'm saying. I think it's a more interesting engagement, and in a way it's also more, it's easier because there's less work. You don't have to do quite so much of this texture drawing throughout. You see. I'm not entirely happy with the way that I'm representing this texture, honestly. I could get like way more involved with it, but I'm not going to. Because life is short. You can't spend all of it cross-hatching. So, shoelaces. Shoelaces are an interesting technology, you know. I don't know how long they've been around, but they haven't really been topped. Shoe manufacturers have tried to come up with all kinds of gizmo-y alternatives to shoelaces, Velcro, and what else? Sort of, well, I guess there was a time when there were buttons, snaps, zippers. But what's great about a shoelace is it's adjustable, it's cheap, and it just requires one small skill from the user, a skill being to know how to tie one, which is something that we learn. It's one of the first kind of senses of accomplishment that I remember having is learning to tie my own shoes when I was, I don't know, 4 or 5. I seem to remember, this might be a fantasy memory, but I seem to remember that it was like I was told it was like a prerequisite of going to nursery school or kindergarten. Like, you've got to be able to tie your shoes. It's like a really important skill. And I don't know if that was just like an excuse to force me to tie my shoes so my mother didn't have to tie them for me every morning. And so I wouldn't run around tripping over them, but yeah, I do remember that being kind of a big deal. Like, I'm big enough to tie my own shoes. I think there's some kind of an analogy, though, between drawing and tying your shoes. It's like, it's a skill. And you just have to learn, like, the sequence. And you just have to learn some principles, like the kinds of principles we're talking about today. And I guess one of the differences between tying your shoes is you kind of don't forget how to do it, really. But then again, who's to say? Because we tie our shoes basically almost every day, unless you're wearing like flip-flops or winter boots. So we tie our shoes all the time, and there's never any fear that we'll forget it. But with drawing, sometimes I guess there could be. All right, so now another thing to think about is that this shoelace is casting a shadow. It's kind of subtle. You can't really see it that clearly from this camera, but it is casting a shadow. And what adding that will do is right now this shoelace is kind of floating in space. But if I anchor it, and I can anchor it by putting in a shadow, but also I have to think about what is the style of shading that I'm going to do. Like I could color it just dark black, you know, as if it was like under a really high contrast light, which wouldn't really work that incredibly well with the lighting that's on the rest of the shoelace. And so I'm going to just draw these kind of faint parallel lines and see how that works. It works okay. It's not merging. It's merging a little bit with these lines, so it's almost like I have to darken these lines a bit. But maybe what I'll do, I think I'm going to change my mind. I think I'm going to do a different strategy, which I am going to do these kind of higher contrast things. It just seems like it might work better. Maybe I can combine a kind of a darker line with a little bit of a faint edge so that you see, like this is a particularly important one right here because it really shows how high this part of the lace is sticking up off the ground. The shadow that it's casting is really helping me to understand that difference, that distance. You know, this is sticking up pretty high in the air. So it's interesting, isn't it, that there's so many strategies for how you can draw, and a lot of them are based on how you're seeing and what you want to see and what you want to say. You know, I think that learning to draw, we think of it as kind of like this binary skill. Either I can draw or I can't draw. But the fact is, it's not that simple because you have to learn to see, of course, but also you have to learn a vocabulary, and you have to devise a vocabulary to say, how am I going to represent the things that I'm seeing? Because in the end, line drawing is an artificial thing. You're taking something that is three-dimensional, that is solid, that is made of shapes, and you're turning it into a series of lines. And that in and of itself is a contrivance, and it's a translation. So when you're doing that, you have to strategize and come up with a language. And there aren't, I think we also think that there are absolutes in terms of that language of drawing, that you just, you know, once you learn how the pros do it, then you're good and you're on your own. You know how to represent everything, but that's not true. You have to make it up depending on what you're doing, where you're going with it, what you're trying to say, and what the circumstances are. You might have to invent completely new tools, new language for expressing it. And because you're drawing something perhaps you've never drawn before, or under circumstances you've never seen before. How do you draw something moving quickly? How do you draw something that is blurred? How do you draw something that is glass that's sitting on another surface that isn't? These are all things that we can look it up in a book and we can see how somebody else once did it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way we have to do it or even should do it. It's really, but what we've been doing today is we've been rolling through a bunch of different strategies for looking at stuff. So we've had this kind of business of doing a kind of combination. So let's start from the beginning. We had this contour drawing, and you can see the difference between this drawing and this drawing is so extreme because there's so little information in here besides the shape. We don't know what this is. It could be a highway, it could be a snake, it could be a random scribble. There's no information there, really, that tells us anything about it. We don't know where it is, and we don't know how big it is. We don't know under what circumstances it is. We don't know what it's made of, etc. Then we have this, which is sort of an interesting drawing because it forces me to go and fill it in with my brain. Like, what is that? And I can start to see shapes, and I can maybe start to figure out like, what is this? So it's a kind of an interactive image that makes me look at things twice. We have this thing that is the shapes. So this is a way of looking, and we're getting in closer to understanding this. We're breaking it down into its shapes so we understand its dimensions a bit more, its dimensionality, and that is helpful. But then when we combine them all together, we get this. I think this just has a lot more information. Tells you a little bit about how I see it. Not a huge amount, it's just a shoelace perhaps, maybe that's the problem. But I used negative space to help to determine the outside. Here I did this overall outside shape, and then I drew the inside shape. So those are the steps, right? Step one was doing the outside, and step two was doing the inside, and then step three was kind of figuring out the inside, the shapes, the internal shapes, should we call them, the trapped shapes. So these are called trapped shapes because they're shapes within shapes, or negative shapes these are also trapped shapes. And then we looked at texture, at material, right? We looked at the materials that things are made out of. We looked at the texture, and we also looked at the lighting, let's call it. And then we also looked at the shadow. So we really brought in lots of different kinds of information to make this into a kind of more complete drawing that tells you what it's made out of, where it is, even what it is. I think in some of these other drawings, you might not have known that it was a shoelace. So those are all kinds of combinations of strategies and perceptions that help you to make a single drawing. So, all right, I hope that was useful, helpful, interesting, and different things to practice, different things to try. These techniques, obviously, you can use them to draw anything you want to. Renata says that her cross-hatching is weak. I've talked about cross-hatching a lot of times before on Draw With Me. The key to cross-hatching is to have, again, a strategy. Make sure that your lines say something. Make sure that you've figured out textures, variations, gradations. Make sure that your cross-hatching isn't just random lines that are going in one direction or another, but that they are perhaps parallel, if that's what you want, or perhaps diagonal, or perhaps they're made of dots. But you have to be conscious of what you're doing in order to have attractive looking hatching that also conveys information. When your lines and your shading are kind of too random for me to fully understand it, if they're too fuzzy and hairy and scratchy, my brain doesn't translate that into tone. It's confused. Is that meant to be texture? Is it meant to be rough? I'm overly aware of the speed with which you did the drawing. I didn't feel like you kind of slowed down and were careful about it. So therefore I feel confused. It feels out of focus. So practicing hatching just for its own sake is a great thing to do, but also thinking through your strategies and having an idea before you do it. What is it I'm trying to say with these lines? What is it I want to say about this volume? And also, how much do I need to do? How much shading do I need to add? Do I need to have the whole thing textured? Again, with this thing, there are lots of bits of it that are just blank, but that they're not white. That they're not blank, that they're not just outside lines. You understand, you fill in because the texture of the hatching has indicated that there's probably texture in those other places, but I'm only seeing the parts where it's in the darkest parts. So again, hatching representing texture and shadow at the same time. It's an interesting kind of technique. Good. So Thistle mentions That Looks Really Real, which is a course that we put out earlier this year, a remix course, and we have a whole thing I go into much more depth about hatching and cross-hatching, and also talking about lighting and how lighting changes the object that you're looking at. So that could be quite helpful. And what else? What else do you have to say about any of this? So, okay, Gail has asked a question. I can see that I really need to hone my cross-hatching. Is this, yes, okay, well, we just answered that question. Sorry, I should have read your question before I put it up there. But yes, there's a lot of stuff to learn, but there are basic principles that are not that complicated, and I think a lot of it comes out of being practicing. So yeah, so try a few of these different strategies. Try these different strategies to capture overall drawing. Don't just focus on cross-hatching, but try and see. Because I think if you think about drawing negative space, if you think about breaking things down to the component parts, if you think about drawing the biggest shapes first and then drawing the smaller shapes within, you'll have different tools to approach any kind of drawing situation that you're in, from shoelaces to, I don't know what else, to battleships, to the complexities of the inside of an engine compartment in a jet fighter. There's just lots of different ways of taking a complicated situation, breaking it down and understanding it, and practicing things like this. You may not want beautiful drawings of shoelaces particularly, but you will, by having a fairly simple kind of subject like that, you will be able to practice these techniques that you can then apply anywhere. I mean, you can approach drawing portraits this way, landscapes, still lifes, anything you want, just through a variety of different techniques. We'll talk about these more over time, but that's what we're dealing with today. Thanks for joining me. It was fun to draw with you. I hope that you got something out of this. And if there's anything you want to say to me or about this, please feel free to share it with me in the schoolyard, to share it with me on social media, and I also hope that you will subscribe to this channel so that you'll be notified next time we do one of these. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We have a special newsletter that just lets you know what's coming up in this particular thing, Draw With Me. Very simple. It's like a 2-sentence email that we'll send you that just says, hey, make sure you got this gear and bring it to you, and just let's draw together next week. So thanks for joining me. And if you're in the Be an iPad Artist class, I'll see you again tomorrow, because we're going to do a webinar and talk about the 3rd week in that class and all the amazing things that you guys have been making and doing and learning, and the questions that you have about it all. So I'll see you then, and continue drawing, continue having fun, continue practicing these different techniques. See you then.